is a comforting monotony to life when you're living alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. My days followed a routine that had become as predictable as the weather. Wake up just as the sky begins to tint with the first hues of morning, make a strong pot of coffee, and settle into the glow of my computer screen. The apartment was a small one-bedroom affair, but it was mine, and within its walls I felt a sense of control over my life that the outside world always seemed to want to strip away. My work, remote and solitary, afforded me the luxury of working in pajamas while the rest of the city bustled and churned outside. I was a freelance digital cartographer, a mapper of online worlds, diligently updating databases with the ever-changing layouts of far-off places I'd never visit. I'd always enjoyed maps, the ordered lines and boundaries, the way they neatly compartmentalized the chaos of the world. My evenings were often spent in much the same way, with only the subtle change of lighting from natural to artificial marking the passage of time. On weekends, I ventured out to the nearby park, walking the trails with my headphones, disconnected from everything, yet somehow still tethered to my small connected device. It was a simple life, and for the most part I was content with it. But one evening, as the light of the setting sun filtered through the blinds, painting long shadows across my floor, the edges of my tranquility began to fray. I had been working on a new project, an interactive map that tracked urban legends and unexplained phenomena across the globe. It was a diversion from my usual work, a side project meant to inject a bit of creativity into my otherwise routine tasks. It was also a fascinating exercise, mapping out tales of the supernatural, dots and lines that connected stories of ghosts, cryptids, and dark, unsettling mysteries. As I scrolled through various databases, cross-referencing stories and locations, an alert popped up on my screen. It was a new submission to the mapping site. An anonymous contributor had added a location marked with a bright red pin. Intrigued, I clicked on it. The coordinates were local, not far from where I lived, and the accompanying note was brief. Location of the red pin. If you find it, you'll understand. It was cryptic, and the lack of detail piqued my curiosity. The map showed a nondescript street corner in a part of the city I rarely visited, a place that seemed to have little to do with urban myths or ghost stories. Yet there was something about the red pin, about its starkness against the map's familiar grid, that nagged at me, drawing my attention back to it repeatedly over the next few days. By the end of the week, I could no longer resist the lure of the unknown. My routine, once unshakable, seemed to falter under the weight of my curiosity. On Saturday morning, I packed a small bag, slipped on my shoes, and set out to find the red pin. The day was cool and overcast, a thin mist hanging in the air as I navigated my way through the city streets. The journey took me into an older part of town, where the buildings bore the weathered look of structures that had seen better days. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten, tucked away from the vibrant life of the city center. As I approached the coordinates, I began to notice something odd. There was a sense of quiet that seemed unnatural. The usual background noise of traffic and voices was muted, swallowed by the mist. The corner itself was unremarkable, just a small intersection with worn pavement and a few struggling trees lining the sidewalk. But as I stood there, looking around for anything that might explain the significance of the location, I felt a strange sensation creeping over me. It was as if the air had changed, grown heavier somehow. I stood there for a while, turning the folded note I had printed from the side over in my hands until I realized there was nothing tangible to discover. Disappointed, yet relieved in a way I couldn't quite define, I turned to leave. As I did, a flash of color caught my eye, a small object gleaming dully against the gray of the pavement. I bent down and picked it up. It was a pin, just like the one on the map, bright red and slightly warm to the touch. I pocketed the pin, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as I made my way back home. The rest of the day slipped by in its usual pattern, the only difference being the small, inexplicable object now resting on my desk. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted. It was a disquieting sensation, like a door had been opened somewhere within the walls of my mind, letting in a draft that stirred the settled dust of my thoughts. In the days that followed, the red pin seemed to cast a shadow over my life. Not a physical one, but a presence nonetheless. It was subtle at first, a series of small, odd occurrences. My computer behaved erratically. Files I swore I had saved vanished without a trace. My dreams, once mundane, became vivid and unsettling, filled with dark corridors and whispers that echoed through my sleep, leaving me restless and exhausted. I found myself drawn back to the map, to the site where the pin had first appeared. There was a compulsion to check it repeatedly, even though I knew it would only show me the same empty corner. Each visit nudged a growing sense of dread that I couldn't articulate. The pin seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a tiny, insistent heartbeat marking time. Then came the night when the unease boiled over into something that I could no longer ignore. It was late. The city outside my window, a tapestry of quiet lights. I sat at my computer, the glow of the screen the only illumination in the room. My mind wandered, and almost unconsciously I found myself returning to the map, the now familiar red pin, a constant presence. As I stared at it, a new message appeared. I blinked, sure my eyes were deceiving me, but there it was, a new note in the same anonymous style. You are marked. Meet your shadow. I felt a chill at the words, a visceral reaction that I couldn't explain. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to rationalize it. Someone was playing a trick, I told myself. Someone who'd hacked into the site. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The pin, the note, they were connected to something beyond my understanding, something that reached into the fabric of my very being. That night, sleep was a hopeless pursuit. I lay in bed, my mind racing with possibilities, with fears that refused to be named. And when I finally drifted into an uneasy slumber, it was into a dream filled with shadows, dark, twisting forms that seemed to watch me with eyes that burned like coals. They whispered to me, voices tangled and overlapping, a chorus of despair and warning. When I woke, it was with a start, the echoes of those whispers still ringing in my ears. The days turned into a blur, my every waking moment consumed by the presence of the pin and the dark promise of the map's message. I found myself wandering the city, retracing my steps to the corner where I'd found the pin. But there was never anything there. Just the same cold pavement and empty streets. The solitude of my apartment, once a haven, now felt like a cage. The walls pressed in on me, and the shadows lengthened with each passing day. My work suffered, my focus fractured by the relentless pull of the unknown. I began to dread the nights where sleep offered no respite, only the return to those shadowy dreams and the feeling of being lost in a maze with no exit. Then, one evening, as the sky blushed with the colors of dusk, I noticed something different. I was sitting in front of my computer, trying to distract myself with anything other than the map. The room was quiet except for the hum of the computer fan when the lights flickered, plunging the apartment into a momentary darkness. When they came back on, the computer screen was filled with a new map, a sprawling, intricate design unlike any I had ever seen. But the most disturbing part was the pins scattered across it. Each one marked a location that seemed eerily familiar. Places that I realized were the sites of recent suicides, all local, all unresolved. And at the center of the map was a larger red pin, pulsating with a steady light. An icy hand gripped my heart as I stared at the screen. The locations, the pins, they were like a web, a sinister pattern that I was now a part of. The realization hit me like a cold wave, drenching me in fear. I sat there, the hours slipping by, as the world outside faded into night. The map remained on my screen, a taunting specter. I didn't dare turn it off, afraid of what might happen if I did. My mind raced with questions, with the terrifying implications of what I had discovered. Who was behind this? And why me? What was the purpose of marking these locations, these lives? In the stillness of the night, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. A sense of impending doom settled over me, a certainty that something was coming, something inevitable and inescapable. I was still sitting there when the sun rose, its pale light filtering through the blinds. The map remained unchanged, a grim testament to the events that had unfolded. I knew then that I couldn't continue like this, couldn't live under the weight of the shadows and the pin's curse. In a moment of clarity, I grabbed my bag and the pin and left the apartment, the morning air crisp and bracing against my skin. I headed to the corner, the place where it all began, hoping for answers, or at the very least, an end. As I stood there, alone in the early light, I felt a presence beside me, a whisper of movement in the air. I turned, expecting to see someone, something, but there was only emptiness, save for the pin in my hand, now glowing faintly in the dawn. And then a voice, soft, almost imperceptible, carried on the wind. "You are marked." It was a confirmation of my fears, a testament to my connection to the map's dark story. I knew then that the shadows would always follow me, a constant companion in the echo of that map. The red pin a reminder of a world just beyond my understanding. It was a knowledge that seeped into my bones, a constant presence that would linger long after the sun had risen, casting its light on the ordinary world. I turned away from the corner, the weight of the past weeks bearing down on me, and walked back to my apartment, the pin still warm in my pocket, its promise unfulfilled, its curse yet to be lifted. The map, I realized, was more than just a collection of points and lines. It was a gateway to something darker, something that had claimed me as its own. And as I stepped inside, I knew that no matter where I went, the shadows would follow. The map had marked me, and there was no turning back. There is a curious comfort in the routine of daily life. My mornings unfolded with precise regularity, each one a mirror of the last, as if I were living in a loop. I found solace in the gentle hum of my coffee maker, the predictable whir of the shower, and the satisfying click of my apartment door, locking behind me as I set off to work. My apartment, a modest one-bedroom on the 3rd floor, was a sanctuary. An island of familiarity in a world that often felt unpredictable and overwhelming. The walls bore witness to my solitary existence, adorned with shelves of books, a few amateur paintings, and a soft, worn couch that had become my favorite place to sit and think. The days passed in this comfortable rhythm until an innocuous evening altered the course of my life. It began with an unexpected email received during one of those languid Saturday afternoons when time seems to stretch, offering ample room for procrastination. The subject line was unassuming, map the world. But something compelled me to click. The email came from an address I didn't recognize, urging me to try a new mapping website called TerraSum. My curiosity piqued. I followed the link, half expecting a standard geographic tool. The website was simple, its interface reminiscent of early internet aesthetics. There was a search bar, and below it, a map of the world. It seemed normal, if a bit outdated, but a peculiar instruction caught my eye. Find your place, mark it with a red pin, and discover the secrets it holds. Intrigued, I entered my apartment's address, zooming in until I could see a satellite view of my neighborhood. I followed the prompts and dropped a red pin directly onto my building. The map flickered momentarily before a small overlay popped up. Secrets revealed. One, I hesitated, the cursor hovering over the phrase. Part of me knew that this was nonsense, just a gimmick. But another part, a deeper, insistent part, was desperate to know what lay hidden beneath the surface of my ordinary life. With a breath held in anticipation, I clicked. The screen transformed, revealing a list of names, each one unfamiliar, each accompanied by a date and the cryptic note, location resolved. Puzzled, I scrolled through the list. There was nothing outwardly sinister about it, yet a nagging unease settled in my chest. It was as though I had stumbled upon a private ledger, a record of events that had somehow remained invisible until now. As I continued to explore the website, I noticed a pattern. Each name was followed by a date that seemed increasingly recent, leading up to the present. In a chilling realization, I discovered a name at the bottom, Evelyn S., marked with today's date and the note, location, pending. My own name and today's date. A sharp, cold wave of fear crashed over me, my heart thundering in my chest. There was no logical explanation for this. It had to be a prank, a bizarre coincidence. Yet the compulsion to know more was irresistible. I began to search for these strangers online, hoping to unravel the mystery behind their presence on this list. What I found was haunting. Each individual had died under tragic circumstances. Most were labeled as suicides, though some had been deemed accidental. I read their obituaries, combed through news articles, and even ventured into forums where bereaved relatives and friends mourned their losses. The pattern was undeniable and deeply terrifying. Each had lived in my building. As night descended, the reality of my predicament became inescapable. I sat in the dim light of my living room, the computer's glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. I felt trapped, as if my apartment had suddenly transformed from a haven into a sinister cage. Every creak and rustle seemed amplified, the sounds of the building settling now fraught with ominous possibility. Sleep evaded me, driven away by a persistent sense of foreboding. I knew I needed to understand the truth behind this cursed list. But my options seemed limited. I decided to confront the building manager, a surly man named Mr. Grayson, who had lived here longer than anyone else. Perhaps he knew something about the history of the place, something that might explain the connection between these deaths and the red pin. The following morning, I found Mr. Grayson in his cluttered office. The room was a testament to his years in the building, every surface piled high with papers and forgotten artifacts. He seemed surprised to see me, though not displeased, and offered me a chair with a grunt of acknowledgement. I hesitated, unsure of how to frame my questions without sounding unhinged. "Mr. Grayson," I began slowly, "have you ever heard about any unusual occurrences in this building? Any stories about previous tenants? He raised an eyebrow, his gaze shrewd and appraising. Why do you ask? His voice was gravelly, tinged with suspicion. I recounted the gist of what I had found, omitting the website's involvement. I spoke of the suicides and the strange pattern I'd discovered. As I talked, his expression shifted from curiosity to something darker, almost an echo of the fear that had taken root in my own heart. I'd heard rumors, he finally admitted, leaning back in his chair. Over the years, some tenants, they didn't fare well. Not sure why, but it's not something people talk about openly. Bad for business, you know, I pressed further, asking if he knew of any previous incidents in my specific apartment. He hesitated, a flicker of something like guilt crossing his features. There was someone a while back, he said reluctantly. A young woman. She didn't stay long. Police said it was suicide. His words left a bitter taste of inevitability. Was I destined to follow the same path as those before me? The notion was absurd, and yet the evidence was impossible to ignore. With little else to go on, I decided to dive deeper into the history of the building itself. The local library became my refuge, a place where I could immerse myself in old records and newspapers without the oppressive weight of my apartment building's walls bearing down on me. Days turned into a blur of yellowed paper and microfilm. As I pieced together the building's past, it had been constructed in the early 1000s, 900s, originally a factory before being converted into residential apartments in the late 1000, 960s. The transition had been fraught with issues, delays, and a series of unfortunate accidents that claimed the lives of several workers. The papers hinted at discontent, whispers of poor safety measures, and dark rumors that shadowed the building's reputation. Yet, it was the discovery of a small, almost forgotten article that caught my attention. It recounted the story of an original tenant who had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind only a cryptic note. "The map knows my name." The phrase sent a shiver down my spine, echoing the eerie message I had encountered on Terra Sum. It seemed impossible that a mapping website could carry such a dark, malignant influence. Yet the coincidences were too numerous to dismiss. The more I learned, the more I felt ensnared in a web of malevolent design, as if the building itself were alive, feeding off despair. On a particularly stormy night, electricity flickering and thunder roaring outside, I sat at my desk, staring at the computer screen showing Terra Sum. The red pin beckoned, a scarlet beacon of doom. I had tried to remove it, to erase my presence from this cursed map, but every attempt was met with failure. The pin remained steadfast, an immutable mark on my fate. Desperation clawed at my sanity, a mounting dread that refused to be quelled. I needed to understand why this was happening, to break free of whatever sinister force held sway over my life. There had to be a way to sever the connection, to escape the fate that loomed over me. In a moment of clarity, I realized that confronting the source head-on might yield answers. I reached out to the developers of Terra Sum, crafting a carefully worded email that conveyed both curiosity and concern. To my surprise, I received a response almost immediately, an invitation to meet with the creator at a nearby cafe. The next afternoon, I found myself sitting across from a man who introduced himself simply as Mr. Cole. He was unremarkable in appearance, the kind of person one could pass on the street without a second glance, yet his eyes held a depth of knowledge that unnerved me. We exchanged pleasantries, and I quickly steered the conversation toward the website. Terra Sum, I began, choosing my words with care. It seems to have a peculiar effect. I've encountered something unsettling. Mr. Cole listened intently, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You are not the first to notice," he admitted, his voice calm yet carrying an undercurrent of gravity. "There is a fault in our design, one we did not foresee." He explained in terms that were both technical and mystical, that the site had inadvertently tapped into something ancient, a current of dark energy tied to the world's very fabric. The red pin, meant as a harmless feature, had become a conduit for malevolent forces, binding the locations it marked to a fate of despair. "How do I remove it?" implored, desperation edging my voice. "How do I stop this?" "There is a way," he conceded, "but it requires a sacrifice. You must face the darkness and confront it with an unyielding spirit. Only then can you alter the path set before you." The nature of the sacrifice was left deliberately vague, a shadowy concept that offered little comfort. I left the meeting with more questions than answers yet. A seed of resolve had been planted. Returning to my apartment, I knew what I had to do. The storm from the previous night had passed, leaving behind a chill that permeated the air. I sat before my computer, the red pin still glaring defiantly on the screen. With a steady hand, I braced myself for the plunge into whatever lay beyond the digital veil. As I clicked on the red pin once more, whispers filled the room, a chorus of lamentations that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I closed my eyes, envisioning the lives tied to this cursed place, the shadows of despair that had lingered here for so long. I spoke aloud, words of defiance and hope, a vow to break the cycle that had claimed so many before me. The air grew thick, my breath fogging in the frigid room as I continued to speak, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon me. I was no longer alone, a presence surrounding me, testing my resolve. In that moment, clarity blossomed, a profound understanding of the darkness that had twisted this place. It was not the building that was cursed, but the fear and sorrow of those who had lived here that had been harnessed, their despair shaping the map's malevolent influence. With a final, determined breath, I visualized the red pin dissolving, my will imprinting upon the screen. The whispers ceased, replaced by a profound silence that settled like a benediction upon the space. I opened my eyes to find the map altered, the red pin gone. The sense of release was palpable, a lightness suffusing the room. I had done it. I had broken the cycle. Yet, as the relief washed over me, I knew that the lingering fear would never fully abate. The shadows of what could have been would remain, a quiet reminder of the darkness that had once hovered so close. My life would continue, a narrative restored to normalcy, but always there would be the awareness of the fragile line between safety and peril. In the end, I had faced the map's secrets and emerged intact, a survivor of my own story. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when the world is still and the mind drifts to restless places, the memory of that red pin would haunt me, a spectral echo of a choice that had nearly claimed me.
It was a typical evening in the woods of northern Arizona, where the towering pines whispered secrets to the wind and shadows danced beneath the canopy. I had always found solace in my solitary cabin, nestled amid these sprawling woods that seemed untouched by time. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth, a constant reminder of nature's raw beauty. Here, away from the trappings of modern life, I found peace. The cabin, simple yet comfortable, had been my retreat for the better part of a decade. It was a place where I could write and reflect on life's complexities without interruption. Life in the woods had a rhythm that I quickly adapted to. Mornings were spent jotting down thoughts and ideas, while the afternoons were for wandering the trails, breathing in the silence that only nature could provide. Occasionally, I would encounter wildlife, a deer cautiously stepping through the underbrush, or a fox darting across my path. But mostly, it was just me and the rustling leaves. Evenings were my favorite though. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest would come alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures setting about their nightly rituals. It was a serene existence, one I cherished deeply. One chilly autumn evening, as the sun began its descent in a blaze of orange and purple hues, I sat on my porch, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket. The woods, as always, were alive with the soft murmurs of the wind through the branches, the occasional call of a night owl, and the distant howl of a coyote. In the midst of this symphony, I heard a sound that was distinctly out of place, a ringing phone. It was my cell phone, which lay forgotten on the table beside me. I picked it up, puzzled by the sudden intrusion. The caller ID was blank, displaying only a series of zeros. An unknown number. I hesitated for a moment, my thumb hovering over the answer button. It was rare for anyone to call me out here, especially from such an enigmatic number. Nonetheless, curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. At first, there was silence on the other end, an unnerving, static-laden silence. I was about to hang up when a voice, barely more than a whisper, cut through the static. Leave. Now. The voice was calm, almost soothing, yet there was an undercurrent of urgency that sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, the line went dead, leaving me with the eerie hum of disconnect. I stared at the phone, my mind racing. Prank calls were not unheard of, but this felt different. There was a sincerity in those two words, a plea that resonated deep within me. I tried to shake off the call as a host, but as I sat there, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, the darkness growing thicker, more oppressive. It was as if the woods themselves were reacting to the message. Deciding that it was nothing more than an elaborate joke, I forced myself to relax and headed inside, double-checking the locks out of an abundance of caution. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The voice haunted my thoughts, replaying over and over until exhaustion finally claimed me. Yet, even in slumber, my dreams were plagued by images of shadowy figures moving silently between the trees, always just out of sight, always watching. I awoke in the pre-dawn darkness, the echo of whispered warnings still echoing in my ears. Days passed uneventfully, but the memory of that call lingered, a persistent itch at the back of my mind. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, listening intently to the sounds of the forest, searching for any hint of the unknown presence. My writing faltered as the unease crept into my mind, casting an unshakable shadow over my thoughts. Then, one afternoon as I strolled along a familiar path, the woods were eerily silent. The usual chorus of birds and insects had ceased, leaving an oppressive stillness in its wake. A shiver ran through me, and instinctively, I reached for my phone, thinking perhaps another call would come, an explanation, maybe even reassurance. Instead, the screen remained dark, an unhelpful companion. I quickened my pace, the unsettling quiet pressing in on me like a physical weight. As I neared a clearing, I stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks, a crude symbol carved into the bark of a tree. It was a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, unfamiliar and unsettling. I reached out to touch it, hesitating just before my fingers met the rough wood, an inexplicable fear holding me back. That evening, as I sat by the fireplace, the warmth of the flames offering little comfort, I considered leaving the cabin for a while. Perhaps a weekend in town, away from the isolation, would clear my mind. Yet, a stubborn part of me resisted. This was my sanctuary, my refuge. I couldn't let fear drive me away. Another week passed, and the forest remained shrouded in an uncomfortable silence. My excursions became shorter, my steps hurried, as if I could outrun the creeping dread that had settled over the woods. The symbol I had found continued to haunt me, its meaning elusive yet ominous. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep indigo, my phone rang again. the same blank number. This time, I answered without hesitation, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. Silence greeted me once more oppressive than before. Then the voice returned, softer yet more insistent. Leave. Now. It's coming. Panic gripped me, cold and unrelenting. I tried to speak, to demand answers, but the line went dead before I could form the words. For a moment, I sat there, my mind battling between disbelief and the primal instinct to flee. Something in the voice, in its very essence, had pierced through my skepticism. Without thinking, I packed a bag with essentials, my movements hurried and clumsy. I locked the cabin behind me, the familiar creak of the door unsettling in the gathering darkness. The forest seemed to close in around me as I made my way to my car, parked at the edge of a dirt road that served as my lifeline to the outside world. But just as I reached the vehicle, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man, or at least the silhouette of one. He stood motionless, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, fear rooting me in place. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, a silent guardian or perhaps a warden. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage, I climbed into the car and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting the figure to give chase. But the road remained empty, save for the trees that lined it like silent sentinels. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, an invisible presence that clung to me. I drove through the night, the road winding through the darkened woods, my paranoia growing with each passing mile. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of the nearest town that the oppressive weight lifted slightly, allowing me to breathe a little easier. I checked into a small motel, the kind that offered anonymity and a bed, nothing more. Exhaustion hit me with full force, and I fell into a restless sleep, the events of the past weeks replaying in an endless loop. The voice, the symbol, the figure, all intertwined in a nightmare I couldn't escape. Morning brought little relief. Over breakfast in the motel diner, I found myself scanning the faces of the other patrons, searching for something familiar or out of place. But everyone went about their business, oblivious to my inner turmoil. I considered going to the authorities, but what could I tell them? That I had received vague warnings from an unknown source? That I had fled my home because of a feeling? Instead, I made my way to the local library, determined to unearth some meaning behind the symbol I had seen. Hours passed as I delved into books on local folklore and mythology, but nothing matched the crude design carved into the tree. Frustration mounted as each lit turned into a dead end, and the unease that had become my constant companion returned in full force. As the sun began its descent once more, I decided to leave the library, my mind no clearer than when I had entered. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the town beginning to settle into its quiet nighttime rhythm. As I made my way back to the motel, my phone buzzed with a new message. Hesitant, I unlocked it to find a text from the same unknown number. Too late. Dread settled over me like a shroud, the words a chilling finality. I glanced around, half expecting to see the figure from the woods watching me from the shadows. But the street was empty, the only movement the flickering of a street lamp in the distance. I returned to my room, double-checking the locks and securing the curtains. The night stretched on, each creak of the building a reminder of the isolation I couldn't escape. Sleep was a distant memory as I lay awake, the darkness pressing in from all sides. In the weeks that followed, I tried to resume my life, but the fear clung to me, a shadow that refused to be shaken. I never returned to the cabin, the thought of those woods filled with an inexplicable terror. News from the area spoke of nothing unusual, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something had been unleashed. Every night, as darkness fell, the memory of the voice, the symbol, and the figure haunted me. I found myself jumping at shadows, an instinctive dread that refused to fade. The phone call stopped, but the fear they had instilled remained, a constant companion in the quiet hours before dawn. Though I had fled the woods, they had left their mark on me, an indelible reminder of the unknown lurking just beyond the edges of comprehension. I often wondered what would have happened if I hadn't heeded the warning, but deep down, I knew the truth. The woods of northern Arizona held secrets not meant for me, and the silent caller had been my only chance to escape the darkness that sought to claim me.
The road stretched out before me, a narrow ribbon of asphalt cutting its way through the dense wilderness that surrounded Hudson Creek. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to creep and twist with an eerie life of their own. The trees lining the road were tall and ancient, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, brushing against the windshields of passing cars. I was driving my old pickup truck, the engine rumbling low and steady, the only sound breaking the profound silence of the late afternoon. This road was familiar to me. It was the route I had taken countless times on my way to the cabin. The cabin was my sanctuary, nestled deep in the woods, away from the noise and chaos of the world. It was my last safe place, a refuge from the demands of life, a place where I could breathe and just be. As the truck ambled along the rough terrain, I let the peace of the surroundings seep into my bones. There was something profoundly comforting in the isolation, the knowledge that out here, I was alone and undisturbed. The first sign that something was amiss came as a whisper on the wind. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see some tangible source of the unease that had settled over me, but there was nothing. Just the road behind me, stretching back into the mists of the forest. I shook it off, attributing it to the creeping shadows and the encroaching twilight. As I continued along the road, the uneasy feeling grew, a gnawing anxiety that I couldn't quite place. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching with unseen eyes. The road twisted and turned, the headlights of the truck carving out a path through the gathering gloom. I turned on the radio, hoping the music would drown out the disquiet that threatened to take root in my mind. That's when the first disturbance occurred. The radio crackled with static, the music fading in and out as if struggling against some unseen interference. Annoyed, I fiddled with the dial, trying to find a clear station. It was then that I heard it, a voice, fragmented and distant, weaving through the static like a ghostly whisper. "Help! Out there! Beware!" The rest of the message was lost to the ether, swallowed up by the crackling of the radio. I frowned, tapping the dashboard in frustration. It was probably just a fluke, a garbled transmission from some far-off station. Yet the urgency in the voice lingered in my mind, a quiet echo that refused to fade. Darkness settled over the forest, the last light of the sun disappearing beyond the horizon. The shadows deepened, becoming more pronounced, more alive. I felt a sense of urgency, an inexplicable need to reach the safety of the cabin before night fully enveloped the woods. I pressed on the accelerator, the truck gaining speed as the road unfolded before me. The forest seemed to close in, the trees arching over the road like a tunnel, their branches tangling in a canopy that blocked out the sky. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, creating stark contrast between the light and dark, revealing shapes that flickered in and out of existence at the edges of my vision. I blinked, trying to dispel the illusions, but the figures remained, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. The radio burst back to life, the static giving way to the same broken voice, more distinct this time, more urgent. "They're coming! Don't stop! Keep moving!" A shiver ran through me, the voice cutting through the calm like a knife. I glanced in the side mirrors, half expecting to see something pursuing me, but there was only the darkness, deep and impenetrable. My heart hammered in my chest, a primal instinct screaming that something was wrong, that I needed to run, to escape. The road twisted sharply, and I gripped the steering wheel tightly, guiding the truck around the bend. That's when I saw them, the first tangible evidence of the nightmare unfolding around me. Silhouetted against the trees, a group of figures stood by the roadside. Their forms unnaturally elongated, twisted in ways that defied explanation. They watched as I passed, their eyes glinting like shards of broken glass in the headlights. Panic surged through me, an electric jolt that set my nerves alight. I pushed the accelerator to the floor, the engine roaring in response as the truck surged forward. The figures were left behind, swallowed by the darkness, but their presence lingered, a shadow on the edge of my mind. I forced myself to focus, to concentrate on the road ahead. I was close now, the cabin just a few miles away, waiting like a beacon in the night. The radio was silent, the static gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that filled the cab. The only sound was the thrum of the engine and the whisper of the wind through the trees. But I wasn't alone. I could feel their presence, their eyes on me, watching, waiting. The forest was alive with them, these monstrous humanoid creatures that defied understanding. They moved through the trees with a terrible grace, keeping pace with the truck. Unseen, but felt, the road straightened out, leading me towards the small bridge that crossed a creek. The bridge marked the boundary, the entrance to the path that would take me to the cabin. I could see it ahead, the wooden structure gleaming in the headlights, a promise of safety and sanctuary. As I approached, something darted across the road, a blur of motion that vanished into the trees. I swerved, narrowly avoiding it, my heart leaping into my throat. The truck skidded, tires screeching on the asphalt as I fought to regain control. I managed to right the vehicle, breathing heavily, my mind racing. The bridge loomed closer, and I prayed that once I crossed it, the safety of the cabin would be within reach. The creatures were closing in. I could feel it, their presence a suffocating weight in the air. I fixated on the bridge, on the solid promise of its wooden planks beneath the tires, willing myself forward. I reached the bridge, the truck bouncing slightly as it transitioned from asphalt to wood. Relief washed over me, a brief respite in the chaos. I was almost there, almost safe, but the feeling was short-lived. Halfway across, the truck lurched, the engine sputtering, choking on nothing. It was as if the life had been sucked from it, the power draining away with each passing second. Panic set in once more as the truck rolled to a stop, the headlights dimming, the engine silent. I was stranded, caught in the no-man's land between the road and the cabin, a sitting duck for whatever pursued me. I fumbled with the keys, trying to restart the engine, but it was dead, unresponsive. The air was thick with tension, a silence that was almost palpable. I could hear them now, the creatures moving through the trees, their footsteps a soft rustle that grew louder, closer. I was trapped, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Desperation clawed at me, a consuming fear that threatened to overwhelm. But beneath it all, a calm resolve took hold, a determination to survive. I had come too far, fought too hard to give up now. The cabin was close, just a short distance through the woods. If I could make it there, perhaps I could hold out until morning, until the light drove them away. I shoved the truck door open, stumbling out into the night. The cold air hit me like a physical force, the chill cutting through my clothes, seeping into my bones. I sprinted from the bridge into the forest, the path to the cabin clear in my mind. The creatures were close now, moving through the underbrush, their presence a constant pressure on the edges of my consciousness. I ran, branches whipping against my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to close around me, the trees leaning in, the shadows shifting. But I pressed on, driven by instinct, by the will to survive. I burst into the clearing where the cabin stood, its outline a dark shape against the night sky. Relief surged through me, a wave of hope that pushed me forward. I stumbled up the steps, flinging open the door, slamming it shut behind me. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the windows, casting strange patterns on the floor. I moved quickly, securing the door, locking it tight, my hands trembling with adrenaline. I could hear them outside, their movements a constant reminder of the danger that lurked beyond the walls. The cabin felt both like a prison and a sanctuary, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. I backed away from the door, moving deeper into the cabin, my eyes scanning the room for anything that could be used as a weapon, a means of defense. The creatures were relentless, their presence a suffocating weight that pressed in from all sides. Time stretched, each moment an eternity as I waited, listening to the sounds of the night. The cabin creaked and groaned, the wind howling through the trees, the creatures whispering just beyond the walls. The climax came not with a bang, but with a whisper, a subtle shift in the air, a change in the energy around me. The creatures were outside, gathered in the shadows, a silent congregation that waited with a terrible patience. I could sense them, their curiosity, their hunger, their desire to breach the last bastion of safety. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The presence receded, the pressure lifting, leaving behind an echo of silence that was almost more unsettling than the noise. I was alone once more. The cabin, a solitary fortress in the wilderness. The creatures gone, as if they had never been. But the fear lingered, a shadow that refused to leave. I knew they would return, that this night was just the beginning. The last safe place had become a battleground, a place where light and dark waged a silent war. The cabin, once a refuge, was now a reminder of what lay beyond, of the monsters that waited in the woods, watching, waiting. I sat by the window, staring out into the night, my heart heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The forest lay still, a sea of shadows that stretched out into infinity. But I knew better than to trust it, to believe in the illusion of peace. The creatures were out there, lurking in the darkness, a constant threat, a reminder that in the end, there was no true safety, no real escape. The night stretched on, and I kept watch. The fear a constant companion, a lingering presence that whispered of dangers yet to come, of a chase that would never truly end. In the wilderness near Hudson Creek, the last safe place was anything but, and survival was a fragile, precious thing, balanced on the edge of a knife. The cabin on the lake had always been a sanctuary for me, a sanctuary of still waters and whispering winds, of the subtle embrace of nature that seemed to cradle one's soul in a gentle lullaby. Nestled in the dense woods of northern Minnesota, it promised solitude far removed from the clamorous demands of city life. It was a place where time stretched like the surface of the lake at dawn, unbroken, serene. I had come here often, seeking peace, reflection, and the quietude that my heart yearned for. My journey to the cabin was always the same, a long drive through winding roads flanked by towering pines and birches, their leaves murmuring secrets to the sky. The air smelled of earth and dampness, a rich tapestry woven from countless seasons. Arriving, I would push open the creaky front door, welcomed by the familiar scent of aged wood and musty fabric. The silence inside as comforting as an old friend. I would settle in, letting the days bleed into one another, marked only by the rise and fall of the sun. In those early days, the forest was alive but gentle, a harmonious chorus of chirping birds and rustling leaves. I would often sit by the water's edge, watching as loons danced across its surface, their mournful calls echoing through the mist. The cabin was a cocoon, and I its contented occupant, wrapped in the simplicity of existence. It was during one of these tranquil afternoons that I first noticed something amiss. I was lounging on the wooden deck, book in hand, the sun casting dappled shadows through the treetops. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of movement along the shoreline. A deer, perhaps, making its way down to drink. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a deer at all. It was a fox. Its bright eyes fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. It stood motionless, simply watching. I waved a hand, thinking to shoo it away, but the fox did not budge. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as though considering something unfathomable. I felt a shiver trace the length of my spine, an irrational fear that seemed to spring from the depths of my mind. We remained like that for what felt like an eternity, locked in a silent standoff, until finally it turned and disappeared into the woods. Dismissing the encounter as odd but inconsequential, I returned to my book. Yet, as the days passed, unease settled over me like an unwelcome guest. The woods, once alive with sound, grew quieter. The calls of birds conspicuously absent. The silence was thick, oppressive, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that fox or some other creature watching from the shadows. My nights were restless, plagued by dreams that evaporated like mist at dawn, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. I began to notice other animals behaving strangely. A raccoon that stared at me from a tree branch, unmoving, its eyes glinting in the moonlight. A pair of squirrels that seemed to follow me from tree to tree, always just out of reach. It was as if the entire forest was watching, waiting. One evening, as dusk draped its heavy veil over the landscape, I decided to venture into the woods, hoping to dispel this growing unease. As I walked, the trees closed in around me, their branches skeletal against the darkening sky. The forest floor was soft underfoot, a carpet of leaves and pine needles that muffled my steps. The deeper I went, the more the air thickened, charged with a tension that was palpable, electric. It felt as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. My heart beat a frantic rhythm in my chest, each step echoing the drum of fear that had taken residence within me. And then, without warning, everything changed. The world seemed to tilt, and the ground beneath me shook with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. The trees swayed violently, their branches groaning and twisting as if alive. A cacophony of animal cries erupted from the forest, a chilling symphony of distress and fear. I stumbled back towards the cabin, the path blurring in my panicked vision. It felt as though the very forest were alive, animated by some unseen force that pulsed with malevolence. The shadows twisted into grotesque shapes, and the wind howled through the branches, carrying with it the deep, guttural moans of something inhuman. By the time I reached the safety of the cabin, I was gasping for breath, my hands trembling with an adrenaline-fueled terror. I slammed the door shut, leaning against it as if to bar entry to whatever haunted those woods. The silence that followed was suffocating, a pregnant pause in the wake of the storm. As I sank into an uneasy sleep that night, my dreams were filled with visions of the woods trees clawing at the sky, animals with eyes that burned like embers, and a presence that loomed just beyond the edge of consciousness, always watching. Days passed, each one more unsettling than the last. The animals had become more brazen, appearing at odd hours, their eyes tracking my every move. The fox returned, always at the edge of the clearing, its stare unyielding and unnaturally aware. One morning, as I stood at the kitchen window, I saw a stag standing at the water's edge. It was majestic, its antlers a crown of branches, eyes deep and knowing. But as I watched, it began to tremble, its body convulsing as if in pain. I felt an inexplicable urge to go to it, to offer some comfort, but fear rooted me to the spot. Then, as suddenly as it began, the stag stopped, its movement ceasing as it turned to face me. Our eyes met, and in that moment I understood. There was a presence in the woods, a force that had taken hold of the wildlife, bending them to its will. It was ancient and hungry, a dark echo that reverberated through the trees, seeking something it had lost. The realization struck me with the force of a thunderclap. The cabin, once my refuge, had become a prison, encircled by an invisible barrier that pulsed with malevolence. I was trapped, ensnared by whatever haunted these woods. Desperation gnawed at my mind, a need to escape this nightmare. As night fell once more, I gathered my courage and decided to confront whatever lurked in the forest. Grabbing a flashlight and my wits, I stepped into the night. The air cold and biting against my skin. The forest was alive with whispers, a susurration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. But the shadows danced just beyond its reach, taunting me. I walked deeper into the forest, my pace quickening as if drawn by an invisible tether. The presence was all around me, a visceral thing that pressed against my senses, urging me onward. The animals were there too, silent witnesses to my journey, their eyes gleaming with a terrible understanding. Finally, I reached a clearing, the moon casting an eerie glow over the scene. In the center stood an ancient tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted as if shaped by centuries of torment. The air hummed with energy, a low vibration that thrummed through my very bones. I approached the tree, compelled by a force I could not comprehend. The ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse with life, and as I reached out to touch the bark, a sudden warmth spread through my fingers, racing up my arm and into my chest. In that moment, I understood everything. The presence was not malevolent, but a guardian, a spirit of the land that had been disturbed, seeking to restore balance to a world gone awry. The animals were its vassals, their actions a reflection of its will, protecting the forest from harm. As I stood there, bathed in the ethereal glow of the moon, I felt the presence envelop me, a gentle embrace that filled the void within. It whispered secrets of the earth, tales of time and renewal, of harmony and peace. I awoke at dawn, lying at the foot of the ancient tree, my heart light and my mind clear. The forest was alive with sound once more, a symphony of life that resonated with the joy of the morning. Symphony of life that resonated with the joy of the morning. The animals watched from a distance, their eyes soft and knowing, and I smiled, understanding their silent vigil. Returning to the cabin, I felt a peace I had never known, a connection to the land that was both humbling and profound. The fear that had once gripped me was gone, replaced by an abiding respect for the mysteries of nature and the unseen forces that dwell within. As I packed to leave, I glanced one last time at the forest, feeling its presence like a gentle whisper in the breeze. The cabin on the lake had been a refuge, but it had also been a teacher, revealing the delicate balance of life and the unseen guardians that watch over it. Driving away, I knew I would return, drawn back to the serenity of the woods and the promise of the lake. For in its depths and shadows lay a world of wonder, a realm of endless stories waiting to be told.